The night Pearl Harbor burned, many in Tokyo believed the war was already half won, and that belief did not emerge from madness, but from a carefully cultivated confidence that had been years in the making. Long before the first bombs fell, Japanese planners had studied America from a distance through reports, stereotypes, and selective facts that reinforced what they already wanted to believe. They saw a nation rich beyond imagination, yes, but also distracted, loud cities filled with jazz and neon, workers demanding weekends, politicians arguing endlessly on the radio. To them, this was not the portrait of a people prepared for a long and brutal war. It was the image of a society softened by success, spoiled by abundance, and unwilling to bleed for distant islands most Americans could not even pronounce. In naval academies and military colleges, officers repeated the same assumptions until they hardened into doctrine. America, they said, was a nation of merchants, not warriors. Its people loved comfort, not sacrifice. Its soldiers might fight fiercely at first, but once the losses mounted, public opinion would turn poisonous, forcing Washington to negotiate. Japan did not need to conquer the United States, it only needed to shock it, frighten it, and make the cost of resistance feel unbearable. One devastating blow followed by a defensive ring across the Pacific, and the Americans would choose compromise over chaos. This belief was spoken aloud in meetings and whispered privately with equal certainty. Even those who felt at ease struggled to challenge the prevailing confidence. Admiral Yamamoto himself famously warned that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but had no assurance beyond that. Yet, even his caution was interpreted optimistically by others, as if the problem lay not in misjudgment, but merely in timing. 6 months, they thought, would be more than enough. After all, what kind of nation would willingly transform its entire way of life for a war thousands of miles away? What people would accept rationing casualties and fear when their homes were untouched and their lives comfortable? Japan answered these questions not by studying American history deeply, but by projecting its own assumptions onto a foreign culture it barely understood. Pearl Harbor, in their minds, was the ultimate proof. The attack unfolded with terrifying precision, and the immediate results were undeniable. Battleships burned, planes were destroyed on the ground, and America appeared stunned into silence. In Tokyo, the news was received with a mixture of awe and relief. Cheers echoed through naval offices. Newspapers spoke of destiny and divine favor. The psychological victory felt even greater than the physical one. Surely now the Americans would see the futility of resistance. Surely now their confidence would collapse, replaced by fear and confusion. What Japan failed to grasp in those first euphoric hours was the difference between surprise and surrender. They saw shock and mistook it for weakness. They saw silence and mistook it for indecision. They did not understand that America's initial stillness was not paralysis, but absorption, the moment when a vast, complex society took in a blow and began, almost instinctively, to reorganize itself around a single purpose. The same democracy Japan viewed as slow and divided was in fact uniquely capable of turning outrage into unity once a line had been crossed. Japanese intelligence reports continued to reassure leaders that American morale would crack. Analysts pointed to isolationist movements, to pre-war protests, to political debates that had raged only months earlier. They convinced themselves that these fractures still mattered, that the country remained internally fragile. They did not realize that Pearl Harbor erased those divisions overnight. What had once been arguments became memories. What had once been doubt became resolve. But in Tokyo, this transformation went unseen, buried beneath assumptions too comfortable to abandon. Cultural misunderstanding deepened the era. Japanese leaders believed they understood honor, sacrifice, and endurance better than any other people. And in many ways they did, but they assumed these qualities could only exist in forms familiar to them. American culture looked informal, irreverent, even childish by comparison. Soldiers smiled in photographs. Pilots joked. Newspapers mixed war news with entertainment. To Japanese observers, this behavior confirmed their belief that America lacked the spiritual seriousness required for prolonged struggle. They mistook openness for shallowness, humor for weakness, and individuality for lack of discipline. They also underestimated the quiet power of American industry. Factories, to Japanese eyes, were symbols of materialism, not endurance. They did not fully appreciate that those factories could be retooled almost overnight, that civilian plants could become engines of war, or that a population accustomed to mass production could apply the same principles to destruction with terrifying efficiency. America's strength, Japan believed, lay in wealth. They did not yet understand that its true strength lay in adaptability. In the months that followed Pearl Harbor, Japanese victories across Southeast Asia and the Pacific seemed to confirm every assumption. American and Allied forces retreated. Bases fell. Prisoners marched into captivity. Each success reinforced the belief that the enemy was reeling, that morale must surely be collapsing back home. Confidence hardened into certainty. The war, they thought, was unfolding exactly as predicted. Yet beneath the surface, the misjudgment was already growing dangerous. Japan had planned its strategy around an American response that never came. There were no peace envoys, no pleas for compromise, no signs of resignation. Instead, there were speeches filled with anger rather than fear, promises of total victory rather than cautious negotiation. Factories did not slow, they expanded. Young men did not hide, they lined up. Women did not protest, they organized. The very things Japan believed Americans would refuse to do: work longer hours, accept shortages, send sons across oceans, were happening with startling speed. Still, in Tokyo, the old assumptions clung stubbornly to life. Leaders explained away these signs as temporary emotion, a burst of outrage that would fade once the realities of war set in. They believed time was on their side, that America's initial fury would burn itself out against distance, logistics, and mounting casualties. They did not yet see that distance only strengthened American resolve, turning the war into a personal mission carried across oceans rather than a distant inconvenience. The misjudgment was not just strategic, it was psychological. Japan believed it understood America because it had watched it from afar. But watching is not the same as knowing. They saw surface behavior, not underlying character. They measured courage by familiar standards and dismissed anything that looked different. In doing so, they overlooked one of the most dangerous traits an opponent can possess: the ability to learn quickly under pressure. By the end of that first year, the gap between expectation and reality was widening, though many in Tokyo refused to admit it. Pearl Harbor had not shattered American will, it had forged it. The blow meant to paralyze had instead unified. The enemy Japan thought it knew, a hesitant, comfort-loving society, was already disappearing, replaced by something harder, faster, and far more determined. Yet the illusion still lingered, and Japan continued to fight, not the America that was emerging, but the America it had imagined. That illusion, born in confidence and nurtured by early success, would shape every decision that followed. And as the war pressed on, it would become painfully clear that the greatest mistake Japan made was not underestimating American weapons or numbers, but misunderstanding the people who stood behind them, people who, once convinced the fight was unavoidable, would refuse to stop until the lesson was complete. The unraveling began quietly, almost invisibly, far from Tokyo's confident briefings and celebratory headlines. While Japanese leaders still spoke of America's inevitable exhaustion, the United States was undergoing a transformation so vast it was difficult even for its own citizens to fully comprehend. The nation that Japan believed would recoil from hardship instead reorganized itself with a speed that bordered on the unreal. It was not dramatic at first. There were no instant victories to announce, no sweeping triumphs to parade. What existed instead was motion, constant, relentless motion machines spinning up, systems aligning, people adjusting their lives as if guided by an unspoken agreement that nothing else mattered now. American cities changed their rhythm. Factory whistles replaced alarm clocks. Neon lights dimmed as blackout curtains appeared in windows. Grocery shelves thinned, not because of panic, but because people accepted limits without being forced. What Japan had imagined would cause unrest instead produced a strange, calm determination. Ration books became symbols of participation, not deprivation. Each stamp torn out was proof that someone, somewhere, was sharing the burden. The assumption that Americans would rebel against inconvenience collapsed under the reality that they embraced it as contribution. The military itself was a study in adaptation. Early encounters revealed painful weaknesses, poor coordination, outdated tactics, inexperienced leadership, but instead of denying these failures, American commanders dissected them. Reports were brutally honest. Lessons were absorbed and distributed. Training manuals were rewritten in months, not years. Pilots learned from defeat with an urgency that startled their opponents. Where Japan expected stubborn repetition of mistakes, America responded with rapid evolution. This ability to learn became one of the most unsettling surprises for Japanese forces in the Pacific. Early victories had created a sense of superiority, reinforced by long-held beliefs about martial spirit and discipline. Japanese soldiers had trained for years under harsh conditions, instilled with a belief in moral and spiritual dominance. Facing American troops initially seemed to confirm this worldview. The enemy retreated, equipment was abandoned, positions were overrun. But gradually encounters began to feel different. American units that had once broken now held longer. Pilots who had once been easy prey began to fight back with coordination and confidence. Each clash felt less predictable than the last. At sea, the change was even more alarming. Japanese naval strategy had been built around the decisive battle, the idea that a single crushing engagement would determine the war's outcome. But America did not seek that battle on Japan's terms. Instead, it produced ships at a pace that defied logic. Carriers appeared when none were expected. Destroyers multiplied. Losses that would have crippled another nation barely slowed the American advance. To Japanese planners, this was deeply unsettling. They had accounted for American numbers, but not for the sheer elasticity of American production. Factories thousands of miles from the front lines became weapons as potent as any battleship. Automobile plants produced tanks. Refrigerator factories turned out aircraft parts. Women whom Japanese intelligence had barely considered filled assembly lines and learned complex technical skills with astonishing speed. The American workforce did not fracture under strain, it expanded. Labor disputes faded. Competition gave way to cooperation. The country that Japan believed was too individualistic to unite had, in fact, discovered a shared identity through crisis. Meanwhile, American pilots and soldiers carried a mindset Japan had not anticipated. They were not driven by the same concepts of honor or destiny, but by something equally powerful: responsibility to one another. Units fought not for abstract ideals, but for the man beside them, the crew they depended on, the home they hoped to return to. This produced a resilience that was difficult to break. Losses hurt deeply, but they did not destroy morale. Instead, they created stories, names remembered, faces carried forward that strengthened resolve rather than weakening it. Japanese commanders began to notice something troubling in after-action reports. American forces were becoming more aggressive, not less. They probed defenses, tested responses, withdrew, and returned stronger. They adapted tactics to terrain, weather, and enemy behavior. The war was no longer unfolding along clean, predictable lines. It was becoming chaotic, fluid, and increasingly unfavorable to rigid planning. Yet in Tokyo, the old misjudgments lingered. Leaders explained American resilience as temporary, a surge of emotion that would collapse once casualties mounted. They pointed to the vast distances involved, insisting that logistics alone would eventually grind the enemy down. But this logic ignored a crucial reality. America excelled at logistics. Moving men and material across oceans was not a weakness, it was a challenge. perfectly suited to a nation built on transportation, commerce, and scale. The first major shocks came when Japanese forces encountered American air power in unexpected strength. Planes appeared in numbers that seemed impossible given previous estimates. Losses mounted in the air, not just from superior numbers, but from improving tactics. American pilots flew with discipline, coordination, and increasing confidence. They were not reckless, but they were persistent, returning again and again even after suffering damage. Each encounter chipped away at the belief that Americans lacked the stomach for sustained combat. On the ground, island fighting revealed another flaw in Japan's assumption. They believed that harsh conditions, heat, disease, isolation would break American soldiers. Instead, these conditions hardened them. Medical units adapted. Supply systems improved. Soldiers learned how to survive, fight, and endure environments that initially seemed unbearable. What was once unfamiliar became routine. What was once feared became expected. Perhaps the most dangerous misunderstanding was psychological. Japan believed that high casualties would force American leaders to reconsider the war. Instead, casualties became rallying points. Names of fallen ships and battles were not whispered in shame but spoken aloud as reasons to continue. Public support did not collapse under loss, it intensified. The idea of quitting became unthinkable, not because it was forbidden, but because it felt like betrayal. As months turned into years, Japanese forces found themselves fighting an opponent that no longer resembled the one they had planned for. This America was patient, methodical, and relentless. It did not rush recklessly, nor did it retreat permanently. It advanced, paused, learned, and advanced again. Every engagement fed into a larger machine of analysis and improvement. Every mistake became data. Every defeat became instruction. Inside Japan's military, unease grew. Some officers privately acknowledged the miscalculation, recognizing that the war had awakened something fundamental in American society. But institutional pride and the weight of earlier decisions made course correction nearly impossible. Admitting the error meant admitting that the foundation of the war itself was flawed. So the illusion was maintained, even as evidence mounted against it. By the time Japanese leaders began to realize that America would not tire, would not negotiate, and would not slow, the momentum had shifted decisively. The enemy was no longer reacting, it was shaping the war. And the most devastating realization was this: America's greatest strength was not any single weapon, strategy, or leader, but the collective willingness to change, to sacrifice comfort, to absorb loss, and to grow stronger under pressure. The misjudgment was no longer theoretical. It was visible in the skies crowded with American planes, in the seas dominated by American fleets, and in the steady advance across the Pacific. Japan had not awakened a fragile opponent. It had awakened a system vast, adaptive, and unforgiving once fully engaged. And as the war pressed on, that system would continue to apply pressure not in bursts of fury, but in a slow, crushing inevitability that left little room for escape. By the final phase of the war, the truth Japan had tried so hard to avoid was no longer theoretical or debatable. It was visible everywhere, unavoidable and crushing. The skies over the Pacific were no longer contested in the way they once had been. American aircraft dominated them with a presence so constant it felt permanent, as if the sky itself had changed allegiance. Japanese pilots, who had once flown with confidence, now took off knowing the odds were against them from the moment their wheels left the ground. What Japan had imagined as an enemy that would lose heart had become an enemy that advanced. With grim patience, absorbing resistance, and pressing forward regardless of cost, the sea told the same story. Where Japanese fleets had once maneuvered with boldness and pride, now they moved cautiously, often desperately. Aware that American submarines prowled beneath the waves and American carriers loomed beyond the horizon, supply lines grew thinner. Fuel became precious. Ships that sailed out did not always return. Each loss was not just a tactical setback, but a reminder that the balance of power had shifted beyond recovery. America's industrial strength once dismissed as mere material excess, now revealed itself as an unstoppable tide. For every ship Japan lost, America launched several more. For every plane shot down, another squadron seemed to appear. On the islands, the war took on a brutal intimacy. Japanese soldiers fought with extraordinary endurance, often cut off, undersupplied, and facing overwhelming odds. They fought not because victory was likely, but because surrender was unthinkable within the framework they had been given. Yet, even in these desperate stands, the misjudgment of America remained evident. Japanese planners had believed that high American casualties would sap morale and slow the advance. Instead, the Americans adapted their tactics. They learned when to assault, when to isolate, and when to bypass. They used firepower not recklessly, but systematically, turning their material advantage into a methodical strategy. That reduced risk to their own forces while maintaining relentless pressure. What shocked Japanese observers most was not America's strength, but its consistency. There was no dramatic collapse, no sudden wavering of will. Even as casualties mounted and the war dragged on longer than anyone had predicted, American resolve did not fracture. Elections came and went without changing the direction of the war. Public debates continued, but they no longer questioned whether the war should be fought, only how best to finish it. The democracy Japan had viewed as unstable proved capable of sustaining focus over years of sacrifice. Inside Japan, the consequences of the misjudgment were devastating. Resources dwindled, cities suffered under bombardment. Civilians, once shielded from the realities of war, now experienced them directly. Yet even then, the leadership struggled to fully accept the nature of their era. Many clung to the hope that a single decisive blow, a final act of sacrifice, might still change the outcome. This thinking reached its most tragic expression in the willingness to expend lives in ways that reflected desperation rather than strategy. Meanwhile, American forces continued to learn and refine. Coordination between air, sea, and ground forces reached levels of efficiency that would have seemed impossible earlier in the war. Logistics flowed with astonishing precision. Medical evacuation saved countless lives, returning wounded soldiers to duty or home rather than losing them entirely. The system kept improving, feeding on its own experience. This was not the behavior of a nation growing tired, it was the behavior of one growing more effective. The psychological gap between expectation and reality became impossible to ignore. Japanese leaders had believed Americans would seek peace once the cost became clear. Instead, the cost became justification. Every fallen soldier, every destroyed ship reinforced the conviction that the war must end decisively, not ambiguously. Compromise, once assumed inevitable, became politically and emotionally impossible for the United States. The very act meant to deter American involvement had ensured that withdrawal would never be acceptable. As American forces closed in on Japan itself, the final illusion dissolved. The enemy was not merely strong, it was resolved to see the conflict through to its absolute conclusion. The patience Japan had mistaken for weakness revealed its true nature. America had not rushed blindly into the war. It had gathered itself, aligned its resources, and advanced with a determination that allowed no easy exit for either side. When the war finally ended, it did so with a weight that went far beyond battlefield defeat. Japan was forced to confront not just the loss of territory or power, but the collapse of the assumptions that had guided its choices from the beginning. The belief that America was too soft, too divided, too comfortable to endure hardship lay in ruins alongside cities and fleets. The enemy Japan had imagined never truly existed. In its place stood a nation capable of immense restraint and immense force once that restraint was exhausted. The lesson echoed long after the fighting stopped. Strength does not always announce itself with aggression. Sometimes it waits, observes, and prepares. Comfort does not preclude courage, debate does not prevent unity, and peace-loving societies are often the most dangerous to provoke, because when they finally commit, they do so with the full weight of their people behind them. Japan had gambled on a misunderstanding of character rather than capability. And history delivered the verdict with unforgiving clarity. The war was not lost because America was stronger in machines alone, but because it proved stronger in adaptation, endurance, and resolve. The misjudgment had awakened a giant not prone to rage, but to persistence. And once awakened, it did not stop, and so the story closed not with a single moment of realization, but with a quiet, devastating truth written across the aftermath. Wars are not decided by how loudly a nation boasts before the first shot is fired, but by how deeply it can commit once it understands what is at stake. Japan learned that truth at an unbearable cost, and the world learned it with them, forever. Reminded that underestimating a people is often the first and most fatal mistake of all.